first time that the FCC and the UNIC are collaborating to do an important event like this. So, as you know, Mr. Ibrahim Thiaw is the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, and he is on a visit to India right now to review the preparations for the COP 14th edition, which is going to be held in India in September for 2 weeks, and also to hold consultations with the Government of India. Mr. Thiaw is from Mauritania. He was appointed by the UN Secretary General as the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and the UN Secretary General in February this year. Mr. Thiaw brings to the position 40 years of experience in sustainable development, environmental governance and natural resource management. In 2018, he was the UN Special Advisor for the Sahel to support the ongoing efforts to advance the recalibration of the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel and the Emerging Sahel Support Plan. From 2013 to 2018, he served as the Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of the UN Environmental Program, UNEP, where he played a critical role in shaping the organization's strategic vision and mandate, overseeing the development and implementation of the midterm strategy and program of work. Before joining UNEP in 2007, he worked for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, last serving as Acting Director General. The desertification is a major problem in the world. The Bonn challenge had set certain goals. India itself faces this problem. 30% of the land of India has this huge thing, and the government of India promised in Paris a while ago to attend to this problem in a very big way. And may I now request Mr. Thiaw to tell us about his consultations in Delhi and the upcoming 14th COP, which is likely to be attended by as many as 5,000 people from 197 countries from across the globe. Mr. Thiaw.
Thank you very much, Vinkat Naya. I'm aware that there's a cricket match somewhere. There's a game somewhere in the world, and India is playing. So I was actually warned that we may not have anybody. So thank you for coming in numbers. As Vinkat said, I came to India last night, actually early this morning, and I will be staying over 2 days this time round, just as a visit to have discussions with the Indian authorities in preparation for the Conference of the Parties to the Convention. Every 2 years, this convention holds its Conference of the Parties. The last one was held in China, and before that, I think it was in Turkey, in Korea, and it goes on. So Asia has been hosting the Conference of the Parties for the last 4 sessions, which I think is remarkable. Indeed, it is one of the regions that is hardly hit by land degradation and desertification. Maybe I need to say a few words about desertification, because many people think that desertification is a wave, like flames or floods coming from a desert to another part of the world. So it's not like that. Desertification is land degradation, which is caused by either human activities or changing climates. and it happens mostly in arid, semi-arid, or subhumid areas, but it can happen, land degradation can happen in a tropical forest as well, when human activities cause that kind of degradation. It is estimated that a quarter of our land is now unusable due to human activities. And 75% of the land on Earth has been somehow modified and has been altered by human activities. Now we have a growing population that we need to feed, and by the middle of the century, we will need to produce twice as much food as today, so as to feed that additional number of people coming, but also to feed a population whose lifestyle is changing, and therefore the production and consumption patterns are such that we need much more food now per capita than before. Unfortunately, part of that food is either lost due to some conditions on the ground when producers are not able to conserve their food, or wasted, especially in big cities and in the developed world, where a human being can waste up to 114 kilograms per year. When I say waste, it means you buy the food, sometimes you even cook it, but you don't eat it. So therefore, the question is, how can we produce enough food for the 9-10 billion people to come without further depleting on our land, on our water, on our forests, and natural systems? If you know that 75% of the land is currently altered, how much are we going to alter before we produce that additional amount of food to humanity? This is what the convention is about. It's about human beings, human well-being. It's about food production. It's about livestock. It's about producing fish in some in continental areas, or even in some coastal areas. The convention is about our own health, given the links between land degradation and human health. As you know, in some cases, sandstorms and desert storms can provoke better? Okay. I was saying that land degradation can be a cause of disease. Our health can be affected by the bad quality of the land that we live in. Deserts and sandstorms pollute the air and can cause respiratory diseases. You may not have experienced it if you live in a greener area, but it can happen in Inner Mongolia in China. It happens in the Middle East. It happens in Africa. It happens in Latin America. This is a serious problem. Of course, it happens in some parts of Asia as well. At the same time, the health of the land can be affected by the chemicals that we use, the fertilizers that we use, and when that land is not healthy, it may affect the quality of the water, and of course it comes back to us as humanity. Another example of the links between health and land degradation is that land degradation leads to soil erosion, and soil erosion affects the quality of the water. And so many people in the world still do not have access to potable water, so they still drink from natural water coming from rivers, lakes, and so forth. Land degradation is also about our economy. We lose up to $1.3 billion per year due to land degradation per day. So every day, humanity may lose up to $1.3 billion worth of resources due to land degradation. This is how seriously it can affect humanity. The convention is also about droughts. This vicious circle interconnections between climate change and land degradation make it almost that every other year there's drought somewhere. Some countries are hit both by droughts and floods at the same time, but droughts are more and more recurring, and they are more and more severe. As an example, all regions in the world have been affected over the last 12 months by droughts. Today, I read an article that Chile is affected by a drought that they have not seen in 60 years. Even places where drought has never been seen before, it looks like being affected. Alaska is an example. So it is a serious issue, and drought, it means lack of water, shortage of water, including for big cities. South Africa was in crisis last year. Some parts of Asia are this year affected by severe shortages of water. It is also reduction in the food production system. Any year of drought in most parts of the world is a year of economic downturn because of the links between the economy and the primary sector. So when you depend up to 80% of your economy depends on the primary sector, and there's a drought, either animals die or the food production system goes down, and this may have major consequences on international trade, as you know, because big producers of some crops may not be able to produce anymore, and that will reverberate as a price surge in other parts of the world, or even it can lead to demonstrations in the streets and civil unrest in other parts of the world. We have seen it. I think you saw what happened in Sudan recently when people were demonstrating because of the increase of the price of bread. It happened also in Morocco when the price of rice increases. Countries like some parts of Africa are dependent on that. So this is what the convention is about. The conference of the parties here in New Delhi will come at a very critical moment in the convention, 25 years of the convention, not only celebrating a quarter of a century of existence of the convention, but actually taking stock of all the legislation, the science, the knowledge that has been accumulated, and turning that as an opportunity for the next 25 to 30 years. What can we do when we know the situation that we are likely to face as humanity? Last point I wanted to mention is that New Delhi is a new opportunity for us. Thanks to a resolution by the UN General Assembly, the decade 2021 to 2030 has been declared as a decade on ecosystem restoration. So it's all of us as humanity that should look at that as an opportunity. There are 2 billion hectares of land, degraded land, that can be turned into a productive land in the world. 2 billion hectares. I don't know how to translate that in acres. So it is a large amount of land that can be turned into a land of opportunity. Turning it into a land of opportunity means creating jobs, because land restoration is a labor-intensive activity. So these are green jobs. Millions of jobs will be created by organizing such programs, including hopefully in India. But at the same time, when you turn that land from a degraded land to a productive land, you create opportunities, longer-term opportunities for communities to produce for food, to produce for their livestock, and to generate income from that. So we feel that our economists, according to our economists, every dollar invested in land restoration generates $5 in ecosystem services. So it's a profitable business. So the question is, why is not the private sector investing on this? What incentives do we have to actually bring them? They are investing they are degrading land from most of their activities, but we are not incentivizing them to actually restore land. Most of the investments are being made in the most productive lands today. So why are we not incentivizing them to actually invest in lands that needs to be restored for further production, of course, and for their own business. Many companies understand that equation, and we hope that in New Delhi, given also the vibrant private sector that we have here, there may be more PPPs that can be built by public-private partnerships, excuse the acronyms. There may be some other partnership that can be built so that communities, private investors, governments would come together and agree on what to do in order to restore. There is a land degradation neutrality fund or facility that was established where private investors are now coming to discuss with communities, including small farmers, so as to come and invest in their land so that the farmers can increase their yield, increase the productivity, but at the same time have good relations with these private companies. So there are some models that can be replicated in other parts of the world. Again, a very good opportunity to interact, so I wouldn't want to monopolize. I'm here also to listen to you, to have your wisdom. We hope that at the COP itself, from 2nd to 13 September, but mostly also during the high-level segment, 9 and 10 September, that you will all come and interact with your colleagues. Many people from the international press will be coming from many parts of the world, and I think New Delhi will be the rendezvous to be in September from 2nd to 13. As you realize, this COP is taking place literally less than 2 weeks ahead of the Secretary General's Climate Summit in New York. So it will be a wonderful opportunity for the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, who is coming for other UN leaders, the head of UNDP, the head of FAO, the head of UNEP are coming. So it would be a wonderful opportunity for them to have discussions with ministers so as to iron out last-minute issues before they go to New York for the climate COP. The interlinkages between climate, biodiversity, and land degradation are absolutely clear to all of us. And land restoration is the very good entry point whereby not only you restore the land to productive land, but you mitigate against climate change, because a land that is restored is a carbon sink, and a land that is restored is also a land of biodiversity, where biodiversity can prosper. So it's a wonderful opportunity to invest on this, not only for the Convention to Combat Desertification, but also for the Climate Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, for economy, for the good sense, and for actually humanity as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Thiaw, for that excellent briefing on the upcoming meeting in Greater Noida, actually, in September. May I now invite Mr. Pradeep Monga to make a few remarks?
I think our Executive Secretary has already spoken much. Basically, would like to know now your views, questions, answers, clarification. I'm wearing two hats, one as a deputy to Ibrahim, but also I'm Indian, and I'm very happy that India is hosting COP14 of UNCCD, and India joins select countries in the world which is hosting all three conventions. India hosted climate change convention, India also hosted CBD, Convention on Biodiversity, and now India is hosting Convention to Combat Desertification. So it's a very proud movement and also a very defining movement, because land provides synergies to both climate action and biodiversity conservation, besides ecosystem services. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Monga. Now, question and answer, yes. You identify yourself. There is a microphone on both sides. Just raise your hand and the microphone will come to you. Yeah.
So does it mean that the chairmanship of UNCCD comes to India now at this convention, at COP14? And is it by rotation?
Is it?
Is it by rotation?
The chairmanship.
No, the decision to elect a chair belongs to the plenary, therefore to the conference itself. But by tradition, the host country chairs the bureau for the following 2 years. So the current chair is China, because the last COP was in China, And it is very likely, I'm not a decision maker, but it is very likely that the Minister of Environment of India will be the incoming president, call it president, of the Conference of the Parties for the next 2 years.
Yeah, okay. We have two questions. One is that, if I understand correctly, UNCCD has a plan for land degradation neutrality by 2030. So, how far are you in that? How's that going? That's number one. And my second question is that I think now there are plenty of studies to establish that the droughts, especially in the Sahelian region of Africa, is one of the major push factors for the migration into Europe. So is UNCCD working with EU to do something about the push factors, given that how political that whole thing is in Europe?
Yeah. The first question, land degradation neutrality. This is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, Goal 15 of the SDGs provides for land conservation. And Target 3, so 15.3, is specifically addressing the issue of land degradation neutrality. It's a barbaric term, but essentially it means that we need to stop the bleeding because we are basically destroying the environment. And secondly, we need to heal the wound. So to use that analogy, so land degradation neutrality is when we reduce our impact on existing ecosystems and when we restore degraded ecosystems so as to create the balance that we need to have on Earth. So that target has been 122 countries at least, if not more, have set their national targets on how they would address this issue of land degradation neutrality, which is absolutely critical for their life and for the livelihoods of their communities. Because obviously we cannot continue to drain on our ecosystems and our economy and to affect the health of our people with land degradation. So it is actually remarkable that in such a short period of time, so many countries have come together to address this issue. Not only those countries that are affected by desertification in strict term, but even countries in tropical forests may have land degradation. So land degradation neutrality has been well received by many countries. So efforts are there and ambitions are there by 2030. So the goal says by 2030 we should find a balance. Droughts are a push factor, one of the amplifiers of migration. But land degradation is another amplifier. We address them as the root causes of migration and conflicts in the world. Let me address the migration first. When you live in an area which is not productive anymore, and your entire life and economy is based on agriculture and food production, or livestock, can be herders, or on fisheries, but your land is not able to produce enough food for you, and you have a growing population, you have children to feed, you have family to feed, you have no option but to flee, because the land cannot produce anymore. Either you die, or either you move or you die. So migrations, transhumance has been a factor in dry lands for millennia. It's not new. What has changed is two things. One is a growing population, therefore an increase in the demand on natural resources on one hand. On the other hand, a reduction of natural resources due to desertification, droughts, land, climate change, and so forth. So the kind of tipping point has been reached in many parts of the world long time ago. So people have to migrate. The other consequence is conflicts. When there is no enough land available, or there is no water available, you may have the land but not the water. Therefore, you see more conflicts between users of natural resources. It can be farmers against pastoralists, as is the case right now in the Sahel that you mentioned. And in a country like Nigeria, I'm sure when you Google Nigeria, what comes to mind is terrorism and Boko Haram. But you know or may not know that there have been more casualties due to the conflicts over access to land and water than casualties due to Boko Haram and terrorist groups. And yet very few people are actually addressing that issue of access to land and water. And until such time, this was my plea last week when I was invited by the G7 Ministers of Development in Paris, until such time you address that fundamental issue of the root cause, why people are fleeing or why are they fighting, you will not understand. You will think that it's a tribal conflict. That's not the fact, that's not the point. It is not that one tribe hates the other. They have been living together, marrying each other for years, for millennia. The change is that the tipping point has been reached and there is no alternative for them. And therefore, you see conflicts arising. Of course, these conflicts are also exacerbated by the fact that there is a weak governance. When you don't have a strong state, or when the judiciary system is not functioning well, and the traditional means of resolving conflicts have been dissolved in favor of modern law, therefore the traditional ways of resolving these conflicts are not accepted anymore by the modern states, then you create conditions for conflicts. Unfortunately, we saw it in Darfur many years ago, the conflict in Sudan. Of course, it was triggered by bad governance when the Janjaweed group was actually supported by the government, but the conflict was over access to land, water, and firewood in the case of Darfur. Exactly the same situation right now. So these issues are fundamental, they are critical, they are related to land management. They are not conflicts for the sake of conflicts. These are not people who migrate because they want to leave their families or are fed up with their fellows. They migrate because they have no choice. And think about the risks they are taking in either paying thousands of dollars to those traffickers, the risk they are taking in crossing the Sahara or crossing the Mediterranean or crossing the Atlantic or another. But one thing that is not talked about very much is another risk, but it's a little bit longer term to be detected, is that these young migrants that leave their countries for the international routes, to take the international routes, they are well educated. They are ready to produce, they are ready to generate for their countries. They should have been the doctors or the nurses or the farmers or the pastoralists, but they flee. So they have been well educated, therefore their countries have invested on them. And they are ready to produce, to go to the market, except that they don't have opportunity to produce or to work in the market. They flee to become what? To take care of the rubbish elsewhere. Not to exercise, to work on the areas that they have been educated, but actually to do jobs that no one else wants to do. And they are not welcomed in addition to that. So it's a loss to humanity, quite honestly. So the best way of addressing that irregular migration is to help them stay home, to generate locally, to restore their land, to produce for themselves, for their families, to avoid dislocation of the family. That's another social consequence that no one is looking at. These are families that have been living together where there is no, the younger takes care of the elder. When the families are dislocated, husbands and wives are not living together, children do not know their fathers, and old people are not taken care of anymore because there is no one to help them. So it's a disaster to come for many families, and that is not being addressed properly. So our call to everybody is to say, take this very seriously. It is not a casual issue; it's a fundamental issue, and unless it is addressed, and unless we address the root causes, we will not be able to resolve the situation as a whole. Sorry to be a little bit long, but your question was absolutely valid.
Yes,
Your Excellency, I am Ashok P. Sharma. It's good to hear you, but let me tell you one thing. This year, water crisis in India is likely because in this monsoon season, there is likely to be deficient rainfall. And government is aware of it and has started acting on it. But I want to know from you, like questions of desertification and drought mitigating or drought adaptation differs from region to region. It is more localized. The crops which are to be grown in times of drought. And so also the land degradation problem, how to develop that degraded land into and bring it into agriculture. These are mostly local and regional problems. I want to know from you what specific suggestions you have for India to mitigate this situation.
You are right that drought does not affect all countries and all regions in the same way. Why? Because people do not have the same level of preparedness, and people do not have the same level of emergency response to emergencies and to crises. Most countries, from the poorest of the poor, have no means to mitigate the impact of drought or floods. You saw what happened in Mozambique. It was hell, essentially. Whenever there is drought in a similar case in the least developed countries, every year of drought is hell. You can have drought in other parts of the world, like in Germany where I live right now. They had a severe drought last year, which actually brought the GDP down by 1 point. In a solid economy like Germany, but you didn't hear any crisis because they were able to absorb it. They were able to absorb the shock. So the response is different based on, the analogy I give is a human body. When the human body is weak, does not have immunity, any disease can come and attack them. It will be a difficult situation for that body. But when the body is immunized, they are more able to absorb shocks. So Germany had fat to absorb that shock. A country like Mali is skinny, doesn't have any fat, because they don't have reserve anymore to actually come and respond to a crisis. So the response is different, and every single situation, even within a country, may be different. The one thing that is constant that we know right now is that we will have more severe droughts and we will have more frequent droughts. I grew up in the Sahel. My parents only knew a drought once every 30 years. My time, it was, when I was younger, it was every 7 years to 10 years. Now it's every other year. So the frequency is there and the intensity is also there. Now, do we have fat, to use that analogy, to absorb these shocks? No. So whether the situation, what is the situation here in India, I'm unable to respond, unfortunately. I hope there are experts here in the room who can help me with that. But the situation is different. It's like climate change. When you say adaptation to climate change, Suriname does not have the same means and capacities as the Netherlands, even though it's the same country.
Apart from capacities, the main thing is that what crops are to be grown in the particular region to mitigate the drought and land degradation. And in degraded land also, you can grow certain crops which will help mitigate against degradation. I want to know that specific things.
That has been studied.
Apart from you told us about the capacities of different countries. No doubt it is true.
Correct. Well, it's part of the capacity. There have been a lot of studies on crops, on how to adapt to droughts, I know this because I'm coming from the Sahel, and again, there's a regional body in the Sahel that has been working for 40 years now, including on crops. Again, it boils down to information and access to the crops. Because you have, it is so unpredictable that you can have, in some parts of the world, the food they generate depends on 3 months of rains. 3 months. So you have 9 months of drought and 3 months of rainy season. And you depend on a thin layer of soil. So at the beginning of the rainy season, you can have very good rains, you plant. By the middle of the season, it's dry. So what crop should you have planted? So it's very difficult to predict, and sometimes in one region you can have droughts in one part of the region and floods in the other part of the region. So it is very, very difficult. So you need a lot more analysis from the Met services, from agriculture services, it's a lot of data. This is what we are working on now on drought, and this will be discussed at the COP here in New Delhi. So since you have that interest, we will have experts from around the world working on droughts. There will be a special day on droughts to come and look at what technology do we have, what information do we have, how that information can be transmitted with the cell phone systems that we have at the moment, and what kind of insurance systems do you need to put in place, because you also need the response. The state governments can respond, but in some parts of the world, and even in the developing countries, you may have some insurance systems that would come and alleviate the risks for farmers. So what systems are there that can help us face that situation? So welcome to the COP, sir.
Yes, please.
Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Aishwar. I'm from Yan Group. We are a media organization based in Delhi. So my question to you is, in the follow-up to the COP14, are we expecting any major declaration or any sort of major commitment coming out of the conference of parties, in the upcoming conference of parties? And the second would be that in India, land is a very emotive issue. It's a very private issue. It also often leads to violence. So let us suppose the government of India announces major programs for afforestation or rehabilitation for land. And that often ends up in the court system or the judicial process because it's private land and often farming land. So are there any specific proposals from the UNCCD, or are there any specific projects the UNCCD is working with in collaboration with the government of India to solve these sort of issues that are based on the ground?
On your first question, yes, amongst the outcomes of the COP, there will be, a New Delhi declaration is being prepared at the moment and will be negotiated. It's one of the outcomes of the COP, so it's a ministerial declaration. It is not the only outcome, but it's one of the outcomes. With regards to investments on land, restoration, the COP will also be discussing land tenure, because this is one of the most controversial issues that I know of. Not only in India, it's all over the world. And how can you promote land restoration, but do it in a way that would not generate further complications and conflicts with landowners or presumed landowners and so forth? It will have to be done carefully. It will have to be done in consultation. And of course, there are some guidelines on how this can be done, not only from the UNCCD, but also from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And there are some voluntary guidelines that have been developed also under FAO on land tenure issues. So there are some tools. So it's not that we don't have elements there. And again, on a case-by-case basis, in each country, people will have to apply whatever knowledge they have, and in some countries land is privately owned, in some countries it's community owned, especially in areas where you have pastoralism. You cannot have a patch of land for every cow, so usually it's for a community, but again, not being altered by a human activity does not mean that that land is not owned by someone. Sometimes that land is used as a transhumance area for pastoralists. So it is a very complex issue that needs to be mapped quite seriously and should be discussed. When I mentioned conflicts over access to land and water, it is exactly that.
Mr. Thiaw, I have a question. It's 25 years since the UNCCD was established, and the Bonn Challenge envisages that 150 million hectares of land desertification will be neutralized or whatever, and by the year 2020, and 350 million hectares of land by the 2030. India itself has taken a decision or given a promise under the Bonn Challenge that 13 million hectares of land desertification will be neutralized by the year 2020, and another 8 million hectares by 2030. What is the status? Have the promises made by different countries been fulfilled? Are we anywhere close to achieving the goal by 2020 and 2030?
You mentioned the Bonn Challenge, which is one of the great initiatives that are out there, not only for the UNCCD, by the way. The Bonn Challenge is broader. There are similar initiatives in Latin America. 2020, there's another one in Africa, African Restoration Program, 100 million hectares. So there are lots of initiatives out there, and these are all extremely good news, because indeed we need to invest much more on our land to regenerate and to produce more. Whether that is sufficient, no. I mentioned 2 billion hectares of land that needs to be restored. So we are not there yet. Whether we can achieve more than what we do today, absolutely yes. And we see a very good movement at the moment and political will. And we also see push, quite honestly, from civil society organizations, from young people from around the world. Many countries, there's someone who spoke, I think, for the youth. Many countries you see even voters, young voters in Europe, it's actually even political parties that are pushing for more investments on nature. And I think all politicians should listen to that carefully. And I think all leaders should also look at that. Not only it will be good for the planet, but it will save us as humanity. We cannot just continue to close our eyes on what was happening in the past. So there's a very positive movement at the moment. And let me just clarify that when we say land restoration, it is not only about trees. Just to be clear, I'm a forester by training, so don't get me wrong. But I keep insisting with my colleagues that, to me, land restoration is not necessarily only reforestation or afforestation. It may be actually agriculture. It may be pastoral land, or it may be any other activity. It can be linked to tourism. When you restore some of the beautiful landscapes in Eastern Africa, it is for tourist activity, not only for agriculture or for forestry. So it is, you have different techniques, and you have different landscapes. In some parts, in some landscapes, you don't even want to plant too many trees, because it has to be open space. Savanna, it cannot be forest. You have different ecosystems, and the drier the land, the sparser the trees. This is how you find you have canopy in the tropical forest, and you have open savannas in the drylands, because the drylands do not have the absorption capacity or the carrying capacity to have too many trees, but they can have a lot of vegetation underneath.
Okay.
Siddharth Pandey from World News. Today you signed the agreement with India, and India has become the official host of the conference. India also says it's going to be the biggest conference. What do you anticipate is going to be the role of the private sector? Because you often mention that $1 invested gets you back $5, and they have a big opportunity perhaps. So will you be also reaching out to the private sector to come for this conference, number one? And on a global level, you've got China right now, it's building this grand project, the Grand Bench. So that's actually altering economies, land, if you will. How will that also play out? Because China's out shopping literally for land and resources, just as India and other countries
Indeed, we signed the host country agreement today with India, which again is a very good sign that India is ready and preparing this COP seriously. So usually host country agreements are signed the day before the COP opens. So this time around we anticipated, and I'm very proud that we were able to sign it today. Therefore, yes, it's a good news. With regards to private investments and private investors, we have invited them to the COP. They are part of our constituency. You cannot conserve land without working with the private sector, just as without working with governments, because the private sector is part of the constituency. Who is producing agriculture? Who is fertilizing the lands? Who is polluting? Who is degrading? So they are part of the constituency. We have to work with them. And many of them are actually eager to change their practices and are eager to actually to have good investments for their own image and for their own business, because they are about business. So you see consumers being very selective in what they consume, and if producers are not aware of that, they will be out of the market. So when I refer to the young people in the world today, to me, these are consumers, and they will be electors in 2 or 3 years from now. They will be world leaders in 10 years from now. So there's a trend that is out there. So all smart business people would actually read that trend, and because business is about long term, not only the short term, the bottom line. Whether all business people are good, no. I wish that was the case, but we are far from there. And there are still a lot of companies that are doing mining activities, degrading land and not restoring it. There are still a lot of business companies that are polluting our lands and water tables and so forth. And but they need to be brought to the table. We cannot just keep pointing our fingers. We have to be open and educate and persuade, point fingers at the same time. So fame and shame, use all the terms.
Last question.
I want to ask, I'm Deputy, I'm a contributor correspondent for the London edition Guardian from Odisha. This is a very liking subject for me. I have seen very closely, popularly in India, it is very popular place Kalahandi and Badagiri for the drought hit areas. So the black cotton soil is there, very rich, but right now, continuous the last years it is suffering drought. And we see BBC and the Guardian has done a big picture of that drought around 1866 timing, popularly known as now. So my question is that the hybrid crops came right now, and it is the cause for the drought in that area, particularly what I have studied. Do you think that the hybrid crops replaced against the traditional crops? Is it the reason for the drought? And do you think that the government
reason you said?
My question is, the government should promote the traditional crops in the drought-prone areas?
Indigenous versus exotic species.
Yeah, well, hybrid species. You said hybrid species, right?
Yes.
To be honest, I am unable to respond to your question with regards to the regions you are referring to, because I don't know them. So I don't know the exact situation in that region. So my response will be very general, and I'm aware that I will disappoint you. But I cannot venture into discussions that I don't have full control of. Maybe someone else, or if I study, I will be able to give you my opinion. Now, there are different technologies that are being developed right now, including by the private sector that we were referring to. Some have been tested and have been assessed as being acceptable. Some are controversial. And still some private sector companies are going ahead with those crops that are seen as being controversial by science or by environmentalists. So again, this is why the dialogues are important. Personally, I have a preference for the traditional crops, and I have preference for genetic resources that have been tested and have been there for many years. However, with the population growth that we know and the demand, the increasing demand, we know that many engineers, many scientists have been working on improved crops. Now, whether these are the hybrid crops you are talking about, some have gone even as far as having GMOs. So these are some of the technologies that are there. I think the debate is still open. Personally, my preference is for crops that have been tested. I'm all for conservation and use of crops that are known to communities, have been tested, technology is known. But again, with the changing conditions, in some cases people have no choice but to go for improved technologies. So, sorry, I cannot respond to your question directly. So my answer is more general. Maybe Pradeep.
Mr. Monga, you want to add something?
Yeah, of course, I'll come back to that question later on. Just by closing remarks, I think this convention COP happening in India is very momentous, you can say, event. I hope you realize that India is home to 18% population of the world, 1.25 billion. And we have only 2.5% of total land area of the world. 2.5% land area, which amounts to 328 million hectares, 18% population. And out of this 2.5% of total land area of the world, 328 million hectares, 30% is degraded land, almost 96 million hectares. So one way the demographics are changing, other way we have almost 30% degraded land. So what it means to make this land productive, as our Executive Secretary mentioned, what it means for ecosystem services, what it means for food, water, energy and ecosystem security for India. And like Mr. Venkataraman mentioned earlier, last month we had land degradation neutrality workshop held here in Delhi, where India pledged to have 30 million hectares restored between now and 2030. It means millions of jobs. Almost we are talking about, we say in the scientific term, 10 hectares gives to 2 jobs. So for 30 million, we are talking about almost 6 million jobs. We are talking about doubling the income of around 10 to 12 million marginal farmers. We are talking about food production, we are talking about water security, especially you asked for the reason of the catchment areas, rainwater harvesting, traditional crops, because it's a mix. It's a very difficult sometimes to answer that question depending on food security versus water security. It means there was a very good article last week that sometimes when you export food, you are not exporting food, you are exporting your water, because water tables are going down very fast. And this is not happening in India, it's all over the world. So perhaps this is time we feel in UNCCD, for India hosting it also shows India's leadership role. There's a lot of good work being done, especially on technology front, capacity building, on information, where India would like to share with the rest of the world, and rest of the world coming to India now to share their best practices. So we feel COP will really provide a very good opportunity for all of us, especially for, like Mr. Thiaw mentioned about soil organic carbon. I mean, I hope you know about it, that soil has more carbon than anything except for the ocean. Soil has almost 25% of the carbon. So what we say is sky mining. We are mining the carbon from the air and putting back in the soil. And that is what we call sustainable land management. And that practices go through for sustainable agriculture, sustainable food production, all value chains, and businesses and civil society. Especially businesses become very important, and we are going to have a business forum also. And we are trying to bring, because no government, no agency can do these things alone. It has to be done in partnerships. And here business will play a very important role to come with those business models, which make more sustainability on a long-term basis, country like India and also other developing countries around the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Before I invite Rajiv to propose a vote of thanks, I wish to give you, Mr. Thiaw, a specially designed mug to celebrate our 60th anniversary. This is the tradition with the Foreign Correspondents Club.
All right.
To give a
logo.
gift. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Ventura.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.